400 Russian soldiers, escorted out of Kidal by the fighters they had been deployed to eliminate. That is what happened on April 27, 2026, not under fire, not retreating through rubble, under escort. The armed factions that Africa Corps had spent 3 years hunting across northern Mali. They walked those 400 men out of the city, past the checkpoints that no longer held, past the soldiers of the Malian army who had been left behind as prisoners. The Russian Ministry of Defense issued a statement that same day. They had, according to their own spokesperson, inflicted irreparable losses on the enemy who, at that exact moment, was holding the door open for them to leave. This was not a bad week. This was not a temporary setback in a long campaign. According to a report published in the Small Wars Journal on January 1st, 2026, 4 months before a single shot was fired at Kidal, researchers had already mapped how this would end. Signpost by signpost. The collapse was not a surprise. It was a prediction. But here is what they are not telling you. Russia is not leaving Africa. They are restructuring, and what comes next, the quiet model, the intelligence-first approach, the maritime expansion that no cameras are following is harder to detect and more dangerous than anything the old Wagner network ever was. If you have ever believed that Africa finally had a real security partner, that the era of foreign military dependency was ending, this video will cost that belief. Because Traoré saw this coming, and what he built in response is the only answer that has ever made structural sense. This is what the revolving power framework does not want you to understand. Prigozhin died on August 23, 2023. A plane went down over Tver Oblast 33 minutes after takeoff, and within 48 hours, Moscow had a decision to make about the most valuable and most uncontrollable asset it had ever deployed on the African continent. Wagner was not a Russian military unit. It was a private structure, flexible, brutal, effective, and completely outside the formal chain of command. It operated in Mali, in the Central African Republic, in Libya. It generated direct revenue through mineral extraction in territories it helped governments secure. Gold, diamonds, timber rights. The economic model meant Wagner was not simply a hired force, it was a stakeholder. And when its founder died under circumstances that Western intelligence agencies described, uniformly and without public debate, as almost certainly deliberate, the entire African operation became a liability without a manager. Moscow moved fast. Africa Corps was announced as the replacement. According to defense analysts, tracking GRU deployments in late 2023, the new unit was placed under the command of Major General Andriy Avarianov, a figure whose name appears repeatedly in European counterintelligence files connected to covert operations across multiple continents. Oversight was assigned to Deputy Defense Minister Yunus Bek Yevkurov, one of the few senior Russian officials with direct operational experience in irregular conflict zones. And the SV Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service absorbed the entire influence operations network that Wagner had spent years building across Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic. Social media infrastructure, local intermediary networks, disinformation pipelines. On paper, it looked like a seamless transition. It was not. Wagner operated with field autonomy. Decisions were made by commanders on the ground, not by bureaucrats in Moscow reviewing situation reports 12 time zones away. The mineral extraction model meant Wagner fighters had direct economic skin in the game. If a territory fell, the revenue stream died with it. That created an incentive structure that pushed Wagner toward holding ground aggressively, because their financial interests were inseparable from battlefield outcomes. Africa Corps operates on a fundamentally different logic. Decisions flow from Moscow. There is no independent mineral extraction model. The operational doctrine confirmed across multiple defense research institutions, tracking deployments throughout 2024 and 2025, is what analysts now describe as hands-off. Advisors, drone operators, training programs for Malian and Burkina soldiers, but not direct frontline combat in the way Wagner conducted it. Not the same incentive, not the same result. In March of 2026, ADF Magazine, the journal of record for African defense affairs, published an assessment that the revolving power framework would prefer had never reached print. The conclusion was unambiguous. Africa Corps was unlikely to improve Sahel security. That assessment was published 7 weeks before Kidal fell. 7 weeks. Then there is the document that Western governments quietly flagged and quickly moved past. On January 1st, 2026, 4 months before a single confirmed engagement at Kidal, researchers published a report in the Small Wars Journal titled The Waiting Game. Signposts of Russia's coming failure in Africa. The paper did not speculate. It mapped. It identified the precise structural conditions under which a military force deployed without economic incentives, without field autonomy, and without deep community embeddedness would fail against armed factions that possessed all three. Signpost by signpost. The analyst laid out a prediction that read, in retrospect, less like geopolitical analysis and more like a confirmed timeline. Here is what that document argued, stripped to its core. When a military force has no skin in the game, no economic stake in the territory it is ordered to hold, no authority to make rapid decisions without routing requests through a capital thousands of kilometers away, it cannot defeat armed factions that live inside the terrain, move through the local population, and adapt within hours. Wagner survived as long as it did because its incentives were aligned with outcomes. Africa Corps had incentives aligned with contracts, renewal cycles, ministerial relationships, budget approvals in Moscow. That distinction is not tactical, it is structural, and structure determines outcomes before the first engagement begins. So why did Moscow sell this model anyway? Because what the revolving power framework sells is not security. It is presence. According to a Carnegie Endowment analysis, published in February of 2026, Russia's revised Africa strategy is no longer organized around battlefield performance. It is organized around economic dependency energy contracts, mineral access agreements, and sanctions circumvention networks that bind African governments into a relationship that is difficult to exit. Deals signed at the ministerial level, not the mercenary level. And presence, regardless of battlefield results, generates leverage. A government that has accepted Russian advisors, Russian communications infrastructure, and Russian intelligence architecture cannot pivot to another partner without significant political cost. That dependency is the product. The security guarantee is the packaging they use to sell it. By early 2026, 2,500 Russian personnel were confirmed operating in Mali. Not a token presence, not an advisory mission in name only. 2,500 men, with logistics, with equipment, with a command structure reporting directly to Moscow. And nobody in Bamako was asking the question that should have been unavoidable. If this force is large enough to matter, why couldn't it hold Kidal? The answer is not on the battlefield. It never was. It is in the architecture the GRU built when it decided, in the weeks after Prigozhin's plane went down, what Africa Corps would be allowed to become, and what it would never be. But when you examine what the GRU actually constructed to replace Wagner, the command chain, the operational doctrine, the incentive structure, what you find is a system designed not to win wars, designed to hold contracts. And that distinction would cost 400 men their freedom. Here is what the Russian Ministry of Defense told the world on April 27, 2026. Their forces had inflicted irreparable losses on the enemy. Irreparable. That statement was released on the exact same day that 400 of those forces were being escorted to safety by that enemy. But the collapse at Kidal was not the real story. What Russia was quietly assembling while the cameras focused on the battlefield is the story. And a document published on January 1st, 4 months before the first shot was fired, described exactly how we would get here. Kidal sits 1,500 miles from Bamako. Not a village, not a waypoint, a city strategic, symbolic, and supposedly secure. When the United Nations peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, withdrew in 2023, the vacuum was immediate. Africa Corps moved in, and for a brief window, the official narrative held. The situation was being managed. Stabilization was underway. The Northern Corridor was under control. According to a report published by the Robert Lansing Institute in April of 2026, that narrative was wrong from the beginning. Armed faction territories had expanded since Russian forces arrived in Mali. Not contracted, not stabilized, expanded. Every month that Africa Corps held press briefings about operational progress, The militant groups they were supposed to suppress were quietly extending their reach deeper into the desert, closer to the population centers, tightening the geographic logic of what was coming. The revolving power framework had sold presence. What it could not sell was results. On the 25th of April, 2026, at 4:56 in the morning, the answer arrived. It did not arrive in one place. The Azawad Liberation Front and Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, a coalition linked, according to multiple intelligence assessments, to the Al-Qaeda network, launched coordinated strikes across 6 locations simultaneously: Bamako, Kati, Kidal, Gao, Sévaré, and Mopti. Not a raid, not a provocation, a synchronized military operation designed to destroy the Malian leadership structure before a comprehensive offensive could be organized in response. This was the largest assault on Malian soil since the uprising of 2012. Defense Minister Sadio Camara was eliminated in a suicide bombing at his private residence in Kati. Intelligence Director Modibo Kone was wounded. Bamako's international airport suspended operations. Flights were cancelled. The capital, for hours, was operationally severed from the outside world. This was not random. It was precise. It was sequenced. A decapitation attempt, removing the heads before the body could organize resistance. 2,500 Russian personnel were in the country, confirmed, equipped, reporting directly to Moscow. Where were they when the strikes came? By April 27th, 2 days after the attack, Africa Corps formally confirmed its withdrawal from Kidal. Not a strategic redeployment. The language of that phrase matters. Redeployment implies intention, direction, purpose. This was not that. According to reporting confirmed by Bloomberg and cross-referenced by France 24, approximately 400 Africa Corps personnel were escorted northward out of Kidal toward Tessalit, escorted by the very armed factions they had been deployed to suppress. Malian soldiers who had operated alongside them were not escorted. They were left behind, as prisoners. Read that again. Russian contract personnel were given a corridor out. Their Malian partners were captured. The revolving power framework, when the moment of maximum pressure arrived, protected its investment and abandoned its client. Bloomberg's headline was direct. Russia bet backfires for Mali. No diplomatic softening, no editorial ambiguity, a bet, and it had backfired. On the same day, Africa Corps confirmed its withdrawal. The Russian Ministry of Defense released a statement declaring it had, and this is a direct characterization of their language, inflicted irreparable losses on the enemy. The enemy was opening the gate and letting them walk out. That statement was not written for Mali. It was written for Moscow. For a domestic audience that needed the framing to hold, even as the facts in the Sahel were moving in the opposite direction. Then came the silence. 48 hours, no statement from Putin. No press conference, no televised address. Nothing from the Kremlin beyond Dmitry Peskov expressing a hope that stability and peace would return to the region soon. France 24 described the Russian posture as damage control mode. The credibility of both the Malian junta and its Russian partners, the network reported, was hanging in the balance. By April 29th, it no longer was. A Malian militant coalition formally submitted a written demand for Russian forces to leave the country. Not a press statement, not an anonymous communique. A formal, documented request delivered in writing asking a nuclear-armed permanent member of the United Nations Security Council to vacate their territory. This is what the collapse of a security guarantee looks like in practice. Not a battlefield defeat, announced by a general. A letter, written by men with rifles, telling men with nuclear weapons that their services were no longer required and that the terms of departure would be dictated accordingly. This is not unprecedented, it is a pattern. In November of 2025, Russia lost access to its proposed naval base at Port Sudan, as political instability in Sudan made the arrangement untenable. African nations that had reliably abstained or voted with Moscow in United Nations General Assembly sessions were, according to voting records, reviewed through early 2026, quietly shifting. The trend line was visible to anyone willing to read it. The Small Wars Journal had written the Mali chapter of this story. On January 1st, 2026, 4 months before Kidal, the institutional analysis had already run the numbers, mapped the trajectory, and concluded that Africa Corps was unlikely to improve security outcomes in the Sahel. That report did not stop the machinery, because the machinery was never about security outcomes. This is not a series of accidents. It is a system producing consistent results, and the results are consistent failure for every partner the revolving power framework leaves behind when the corridor opens and its personnel walk north. Kidal was not an exception. Kidal was the demonstration. Putin said nothing for 72 hours, not because he had no answer, because the answer was not for the press. It was for the architects of what comes next. While the cameras were focused on Kidal, something else was happening. China now controls 26% of West Africa's arms market. Russia's share has collapsed 44% since 2019. Not gradually, not slowly, a collapse. But the numbers are not the catastrophe. What Russia gave up to make room for China, and why they gave it willingly, is the catastrophe. That transition was sealed, while Africa Corps was still issuing statements about operational progress, and the deal that made it permanent was never announced in any press conference you were invited to watch. Putin said nothing for 72 hours, not because he had no answer, because the answer was not for the press. It was for the architects of what comes next, and while Moscow stayed silent, Ouagadougou had already moved. 9 days before the attack, the Alliance of Sahel states approved a 15,000-troop rapid deployment framework. 9 days. The Western press called it A's paralysis, when those troops never crossed into Mali. They called it indecision. They called it dysfunction. They were using the wrong frame. Traoré understood something that required no meeting, no briefing, no intelligence report to confirm. The crisis in Mali was caused by the failure of external forces deployed without community embeddedness. Sending more external forces, even African ones, even allied ones, into that same vacuum was not a solution. It was a repetition. It was doing the thing that had already failed and expecting a different result, because the flag on the uniform had changed. Africa Corps was, as documents from its own operational structure confirm, designed to hold contracts, not win wars. Traoré did not need to read that sentence to know the truth it described. He had watched it happen in real time, across a border he shares with Mali, from a government that had already lived through its own iteration of the same experiment. The answer to a framework built on extraction and exit was not to join that framework with more bodies. It was to build something different, so he did. The Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, the VDP, now stands at 85,731 members. That number has tripled since Traoré took power. Tripled, but the number is not the point. The structure is the point. VDP members are local people defending local territory. They know the terrain because they grew up walking it. They know the population because they are the population. They have relationships, histories, debts, and loyalties that no external contractor can purchase, replicate, or simulate after 6 weeks of deployment briefings. When a VDP unit holds a village, they are holding their own village. Their parents are there. Their children are there. If the position falls, the casualty is not a statistic in a ministry report, it is their family. This is precisely what the Small Wars Journal analysis published January 1st, 2026 identified as the irreducible requirement for success against locally embedded armed factions. Forces without community embeddedness cannot defeat local factions. The journal was describing Africa Corps' structural failure. Traoré had been building the structural answer for 2 years before that sentence was published. This is not coincidence. This is strategy. Records indicate that Traoré's government reviewed regional security literature extensively during the VDP expansion phase. The Robert Lansing Institute published findings in April 2026, documenting that armed groups operating in Mali had expanded their territorial control since Russian personnel arrived. Not contracted, not stabilized, expanded. The presence of Africa Corps had not reversed the insurgency. It had, according to documents reviewed across multiple conflict monitoring organizations, coincided with its acceleration. Traoré read these reports, not because he needed the evidence. He had observed the reality directly from a neighboring country, with his own intelligence apparatus tracking movement patterns across a shared border. He read them because he wanted documentation. When Western governments accused him of allowing instability to spread by declining to participate in the external intervention model, he had an answer. The answer was not an argument. The answer was a citation. The data confirming the external model's failure came from Western research institutions, the same institutional world that was demanding he adopt the model they had already proven didn't work. The fact that you are still watching that you made it. This far means you already understand something most analysts in Washington and Paris are still refusing to write. Traoré's silence during the April 25th crisis was not passivity. His decision not to deploy into Mali was not weakness. It was the application of a framework he had already built, already stress-tested, and already chosen over the alternative, not because it was easier, but because the evidence had told him repeatedly and consistently that the alternative produced consistent failure for every partner the revolving power framework leaves behind when the corridor opens and its personnel walk north. He upgraded Burkina Faso's border security infrastructure during this period. He accelerated VDP expansion into frontier zones. He ensured that Burkina Faso did not become Africa Corps' second experiment, while Mali burned under the weight of the first. This was deliberate. Every element of it was deliberate. The truth about VDP is not hidden because it is difficult to find. It is hidden because it asks a question nobody in the revolving power framework wants to answer. If the local model works, why do they keep selling the foreign one? That question has an answer. The answer is contracts. The answer is leverage. The answer is that a security model built on local ownership produces local sovereignty, and local sovereignty cannot be invoiced, cannot be renegotiated, cannot be withdrawn when a government makes decisions that displease the contractor's home ministry. The revolving power framework does not fail by accident. It succeeds at what it is actually designed to do. Traoré understood this. He built something that operates outside that design entirely. Something that, by definition, the framework cannot absorb, cannot co-opt, and cannot replace with a better branded version of the same extraction model. He did not protest the framework. He made it irrelevant, one volunteer at a time, in 85,731 acts of local sovereignty that no external audit can accurately price. Traoré did not just predict that foreign military models would fail in the Sahel. He built something that makes the question irrelevant. But to understand what he built, you first have to understand what China is now doing with the door Russia left open. 4 days before Kidal fell, the Sentry published a confirmed report. Russia was not pulling back. Russia was expanding. New weapons deliveries to Sahel governments, a naval hub under active construction in Guinea. Increased Africa Corps footprint across 3 countries. 4 days before the collapse they would later call a tactical redeployment. Russia is not retreating from Africa. They are changing what their presence looks like from soldiers in the field to something quieter, deeper, and far more difficult to see. And the model they are moving toward does not require holding Kidal. It requires holding something else entirely. Russia did not lose the Sahel. Russia pivoted. That distinction matters. Because the story most analysts are telling right now, the story of Russian retreat, Russian failure, Russian humiliation at Kidal, that story ends too soon. It stops at the moment the 400 were escorted out. It does not ask what happened next. What happened next was a redesign. According to reporting by the Sentry published April 21, 2026, 4 days before the Kidal withdrawal was finalized, Russia was not contracting. Russia was expanding. New weapons deliveries were being processed. A naval infrastructure center was under active construction in Guinea. The Africa Corps footprint in Mali, Niger, Sudan, Libya, and the Central African Republic remained intact. But the role assigned to that footprint was changing. The boots-on-ground model, the one that put 2,500 Russian personnel in Mali and still could not hold Kidal, that model is being retired. What is replacing it is smaller, quieter, and more durable. Intelligence advisors, signals infrastructure, influence operations run through S-sphere networks rather than GRU field units. Russia is converting from a land-based security contractor into a maritime and intelligence layer. It no longer needs to hold cities. It needs to hold ports. It needs to hold mineral contracts. It needs to hold the architecture of influence that survives even when the soldiers leave. The Sudan naval base, the one announced with ceremony, The one designed to anchor Russian presence in the Red Sea was suspended in November 2025 due to internal Sudanese instability. But Guinea is moving forward. The pivot is not theoretical, it is under construction. And while Russia was still reorienting, China walked through the door. Not with soldiers, not with a private military corporation, not with anything that would generate headlines about intervention or occupation. China moved in with contracts, with credit lines, with hardware priced below any Western alternative, and with a training architecture that does not come attached to either restrictions or congressional oversight. Records indicate that between 2019 and 2023, Russia's share of the West African arms market fell by 44%. China's share rose to 26%, making it the dominant supplier in a region Russia once considered its exclusive sphere of influence. Russia now holds 11%. China holds more than twice. That the mechanism is straightforward. China sells below market rate. China offers long-term financing. China accepts resource extraction agreements in lieu of cash payment: gold, uranium, lithium, cobalt, exchanged for platforms, systems, and training. And China does not attach governance conditions. It does not require electoral reform. It does not issue statements about democratic backsliding. It invoices, it delivers, it moves on. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the FOCAC framework covering 2024 through 2027. Documents confirm a commitment to train 6,500 African military and police personnel. The curriculum includes C4ISER integration, countered operations, and high-heat low-resource environment doctrine, exactly the tactical profile of the Sahel. China is not offering ceremonial training. It is building operational capacity in the theater it intends to supply for the next decade. And then there is the signal that most Western analysts underweighted. January 2026, Russian, Chinese, and Iranian naval vessels conducted joint exercises off the southern coast of South Africa. 3 powers, 1 exercise, 1 message. These two are not competing in Africa. They are dividing the roles. Russia holds the political layer, the narrative of anti-colonialism, the symbolic value of having been the power that helped expel France and the United States. The flag that Sahelian protesters wave is not Chinese. It is Russian. That symbol has value, and Russia intends to keep it. China holds the economic layer, the arms, the infrastructure, the extraction agreements, the quiet architecture that does not require a flag at all, because the contracts are enough. The alliance of Sahel states sits between these two powers, and both of them want the same things from the ground beneath it: gold, uranium, lithium, cobalt. Neither of them arrived because they care about Sahelian sovereignty. Russia opened the door by removing France and the United States, but that door did not open for Africa. It opened for Russia, and now, with Russia mid-pivot, it is opening wider for China to step through. This is why the question of who controls the security apparatus of the Sahel is not a military question. It is an economic one. Whoever controls the security apparatus controls the conditions under which contracts are signed. Whoever controls the contract environment controls the terms on which resources leave the ground. The revolving power framework does not change its logic when the flag above the base changes. It only changes the name of the beneficiary. And this is why the VDP model, 85,731 local members, built on community enrollment, funded through local governance structures, operating without a foreign contractor's invoice attached, is not simply a military tactic. It is an economic declaration. A security architecture that cannot be invoiced, cannot be leveraged. A force that is locally owned cannot be withdrawn when a minister in Moscow or Beijing makes a call to a ministry in Ouagadougou. Traoré understood the framework before the framework revealed itself this clearly. He began constructing the alternative while Russia was still being celebrated as the liberator, and China was still being described as the neutral partner. He saw the pivot before the pivot was visible. But even the strongest local model has a timing problem. The Kidal withdrawal created a window, a short interval in which both major powers are mid-repositioning, neither fully settled into the new architecture they are building. Inside that window, the alliance of Sahel states has a specific and finite opportunity. Build fast enough, build deep enough, Extend the local sovereignty model far enough into the security and economic infrastructure that when both Russia and China complete their pivots, when the new roles are locked and the new contracts are signed, the AES no longer has to choose a side, because it has already built something that neither side controls. Whether that window is still open is the question that follows everything else. The question is no longer who controls the Sahel's security apparatus. The question is whether the Sahel will ever control its own. Here is what this video proved. Africa Corps was never a security architecture. It was a contract management system deployed inside a conflict zone. Records indicate that Western researchers identified the structural failure 4 months before the withdrawal began, before the convoys formed, before the flags were folded, before 400 personnel were escorted out by the very rebels they had been deployed to suppress. The model was not defeated in the field. It was obsolete by design, from the day the first agreement was signed. A structure built to hold contracts cannot adapt when the contract becomes the liability. Russia did not leave. Russia repositioned. The maritime layer is expanding. The intelligence architecture is being rebuilt at depth, further from the headlines, further from the footage of withdrawal convoys and crowds. And while that repositioning was still in motion, China moved into the space, without announcing itself 26% of West Africa's arms market, growing quarter over quarter, with an 11% Russian share that has declined 44% over the same measurement window. 2 powers, 2 lanes, no visible friction between them. That is not competition. That is coordination without a public agreement. Division of labor dressed as a multipolar world. And through all of it, through the celebrations, through the transitions, through every narrative about liberators and neutral partners and historic realignments, there were 85,731 people that no minister in Moscow or Beijing could make a single call about. No contract covers them. No leverage touches them. No withdrawal order applies when the political calculation changes in a capital 6,000 kilometers away. The VDP is not a military tactic. It is an economic sovereignty declaration written in community membership, local accountability, and the specific decision to build something that the revolving power framework cannot reach. It is the only structure in this entire picture that cannot be invoiced. Those 3 things did not happen in isolation. They are the same story told from 3 different angles, across 3 different power centers, converging on one question. Who actually controls the terms? You just watch the full picture come together. Not the version that gets broadcast at transition ceremonies. Not the version that treats security partnerships as neutral transactions between willing equals. The version that follows the incentive structures, the contract terms, the repositioning timelines, and the one model that operates entirely outside all of it. If this video changed how you understand the difference between partnership and sovereignty, share it. Specifically, share it with someone who is still using the word partner without asking who wrote the contract, who enforces it, and who benefits when it ends. If the VDP model shifted how you think about security in the Sahel, not as a military question, but as a structural sovereignty question, hit like, not as a reflex, as a signal that this level of analysis is worth building on. And drop this in the comments. Ahead of them, your country, and one thing this video changed in how you see Russia's actual role in Africa right now. Not the role that gets announced at summits. The role that gets built while the announcement is still being applauded. Drop all 3. Let's see who's actually paying attention. There is one more piece of this story that most people never reach. The VDP did not emerge without context, and Mali's trajectory after the external security framework collapsed did not resolve cleanly or quietly. What happened to the communities that built local structures when the outside architecture came apart? That story has a specific and documented shape. It connects directly to everything you just watched. That video is already on the channel. If this one changed how you see the Sahel, that one will change how you see what comes after sovereignty begins.